Okay, well, thanks very much for the introduction. Thanks very much for the welcome. Thank you very much for coming. My job is very simple. I have to do nothing really except be a timekeeper and ensure that the questions from the floor are decent and truthful. So without further ado, I'd like to start us off. We have three presenters tonight. 20 minutes is their time. I'm actually very, very rigorous in enforcing that. First up, we have Amedee Turner QC, an Honourary MEP, who's got a very long and very distinguished biography. I won't read it all out because it'll take us 20 minutes to do so. But just to say he's a very distinguished QC, parliamentarian, very long list of publications, and authority in a number of areas, including religion and politics. And I'm very excited to spend time with him. Following him will be Dr Kirsten Schulze from the London School of Economics, who's a lecturer in international history. She too has an impressive and lengthy biography and bibliography, and I won't also spend 20 minutes going over that. To say that she is an expert in Israeli politics, regional conflict in Indonesia, Islamic groups in Indonesia, and speaks many languages, and basically a pretty well-rounded individual. And finally, we have Avril Ilhan from King's College. Don't have her biography here, so I can't tell you a thing about her. She'll probably say something when she speaks in due course. But first of all, I'd like us to give a warm welcome to Amedee Turner QC.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I may burst out with a terrific cough at any moment, but it's not swine flu, and you needn't run away. Now I'm going to talk about a project we did for the United Nations Observer of the Archbishop of Canterbury. We were wondering about the question Samuel Huntington alleged a clash of civilizations some years ago, and at that time it was talked about a lot, and we decided to look into it. We decided that if there was a clash between Islam and the West, that really meant a clash between Islam and Western democracy. Because democracy is, in a way, the religion of the West. It's a principle in the West, as Islam is the principle of the Muslim world. Now, of course, we knew that some clerics and academics were against democracy in principle, on the grounds it was incompatible with Islam. We also knew there were some political extremists who are against democracy for purely political reasons. And so we decided to go to ordinary Muslims living in Britain and America who were just leading their ordinary lives, not academics, not clerics, and I don't think there were any lawyers either. They were just ordinary people. And with their spouses, we got them together in 38 groups across the two countries, about a dozen in each group, and they each met 3 times for 2.5 hours and talked about democracy and wrote down everything they wanted to about it. They were left to get on by themselves, and they could write down what they liked. They were asked not to try to come to an agreed statement or anything like that in these 38 meetings, but each person say what he thinks and to change his mind as the discussion went on. And one reason for this turns out to be a sensible one since, that the Gallup poll has said that 55% of non-Muslims living in the West either think that Islam is incompatible with democracy or they don't know. And so it was very important to get some answer to these people, not from academics, but from ordinary people, the people they were living amongst. And I think that justified the whole operation. They were all offered anonymity, these 400 Muslims, because they were in some cases concerned about security and that kind of thing. And as I say, they came with their spouses. I'm told I mustn't say wives or husbands. They were business people, engineers, professional people, school teachers and students. Some of the meetings were entirely student meetings, but most of them were mixed. And they were not the sort of people who ordinarily think about political systems although I hope they voted in elections in Britain and America. But they were experienced, of course, in democracy because they were living in these two countries with all its imperfections. Yes, I thought that might happen. But I'm perfectly all right, thank you. A report was then written, 100 pages long. Now I've got something to 100 pages long, which set out every single thing they said, they wrote down. Everything they wanted to be said was set out in this report. And the question simply was, is democracy compatible with Islam? They were told to ignore British and American peculiarities of democracy, which you're well familiar with, first past the post, and the fact that George Brown has never had a majority in the country voted for, but always less than 50%. And that Gordon Brown, thank you, Debbie, Gordon Brown. I'm rather old, and I think of the other Brown was about 1950, I think. So they were told not to bother about the peculiarities of Britain and America, but simply think of democracy as this: one person, one vote, and not one person, one vote, one time, which theoretically, of course, is democracy. If a party stands in an election and says, if you vote for me, I'll abolish the parliament, and they then do so, that's democratic. But it's too easy to say, yes, I agree with democracy because I can vote against it in the election. So we said one person, one vote, one time is not democracy. The secret ballot, the government to follow the majority of the vote, and protection of minorities in countries where there was a big minority that might probably never form the government because it was not big enough for that. It was a substantial minority. Those minorities don't exist in either Britain or America, but they do exist in many Muslim countries. Now they ignored the existing Muslim democracies almost entirely. There was hardly a reference to Turkey, Malaysia, Indonesia or Pakistan, and they just discussed democracy as a notional idea for a Muslim country, which of course is exactly what we wanted them to do, although they weren't asked to do that, but that's exactly what we wanted. We didn't want them to talk about particular cases, but we wanted them to think about a notional Muslim country which was democratic. Is it compatible with Islam? Now the first conclusion they came to was there's only one principle, one ideal, and that is Islam. And of course democracy therefore could not be an ideal or principle. Islam, as one of them said, is drawn down from heaven. Democracy, on the other hand, they regard as being man-made and evolving and imperfect, pragmatic, possibly improving, and might work well and might work badly. At a meeting just recently in Westminster University, the Muslim speaker said democracy is a technology, which I thought was an extremely good expression, and states exactly what Muslims think. It's not an ideal, it's a way of doing things. And therefore, these 400 Muslims said there was no clash between Islam and democracy, because Islam is up here as a principle, the principle, and democracy is down here as a mere one way of many of doing things. The second conclusion they came to was that democracy is not a global concept. In other words, it's not something that they think should or could be simply applied everywhere because it's good in one place. And so the conclusion was that they didn't say that democracy was right or wrong as an ideal or principle, though they did realize that because there were also non-Muslims meeting with them, being hosts really, and handing around coffee and things like that, taking part in discussions. And they realized that democracy is a principle for non-Muslims in the West. Probably that we might say it's the chief principle of an ideal of the West. And so their only question was, how good or bad as a political practice is democracy for running a country? And the most optimistic of these 400 said it is probably the best way. And that is really rather like what Winston Churchill said some time ago. Democracy is a bad form of government, but all others are worse. In other words, we don't say it's a terrific thing, but it's probably the best you can get. The least favourable view of these Muslims was it doesn't work because members of parliament don't represent the people. And so you see that the ambit of views between it's probably the best of a bad lot and it doesn't work is quite narrow. And none of them said it was wrong in principle. And of course none of them said it was right in principle, because they didn't think it was a principle. And so the conclusion is that they accepted democracy as a way of doing things, with one reservation, and that's this: nothing shall happen contrary to the Quran. And I think that was added really as a kind of almost an automatic postscript. Nothing shall happen contrary to the Quran in this notional democracy in a Muslim country. Of course they were completely right and logical, because the Quran is undisputed. The book explains all things and nothing is omitted from the book. And as I asked you earlier, I thought it also said reject nothing in the book, but you couldn't find where that came. So, but the Quran definitely says the book explains all things and nothing is omitted from the book. And therefore, of course, it must, any democracy which is operated in a Muslim country must do nothing which is contrary to the Quran. That's an obvious conclusion. They did not say that nothing must happen contrary to the Hadith, which of course would mean hopeless, because the Hadith, there are all sorts of views in the Hadith, and many of them are contradictory. And the various schools of thought didn't say them, they simply said the Quran. And in that, I think they were completely correct. They gave the ideal answer, in other words. Now, of course, I've only read the Quran in translation, and I look at it as an outsider. In fact, I've read it specifically looking at as a former member of the European Parliament who would say what would happen in the European Parliament if there was a rule that said nothing shall happen contrary to the Quran. And as that, in that way, I have looked at it fairly carefully. You might say, as I'm also a lawyer, that I looked at it slightly too legalistically, just to see what is contrary to the Quran, which might be worrying for a legislator. And I come to these conclusions. It is perfectly practical to exclude from ordinary government what is contrary to the Quran. A few crimes are described. There are food laws, intoxication, gambling, infanticide, usury, miserly behavior, disobedience to God and Muhammad, apostasy and blasphemy. All those are mentioned. I think those are the only forbidden acts which are mentioned actually in the Quran. But there are very few punishments attached to those crimes or forbidden acts. So you will not find in the Quran a punishment for apostasy. And therefore, when one reads of apostates being condemned to death, that's not because of the Quran, it's because of something that's happened since. Same is true of blasphemy. And so one then looks to see what is given a punishment in the Quran, which means the Parliament would actually have to apply that in its legislation. When it's dealing with things like apostasy and food laws and so on, there is no punishment, and therefore there is no crime on this earth. The punishment, of course, is in hell. and there's a great deal of that, you know. But that does not concern a parliament, because fortunately parliaments don't pass laws about hell. So the few punishments which do it, you look rather puzzled. Parliaments don't have to bother about what will happen in the next life. They simply pass laws about what should be the punishment in this life. And so all the crimes I mentioned so far don't have punishment, and therefore the Quran is no obstacle to a parliament. The crimes which do have punishment are adultery, 100 strokes, but not, I may say, stoning. Stoning does not occur in the Quran at all. Theft, which of course, as you know, is cutting off the hand unless the thief repents and restores what was taken, or is starving. And so, again, a parliament would not find it so terribly difficult to pass a law about that, because repentance is sufficient. False accusation of fornication is 80 strokes. Lewdness between men is, it says, punish them once and then leave them. Now, those are the only punishments in the Quran. So those are the only bars that a legislator would have when dealing with criminal matters. As I mentioned, nearly all punishments are actually in hell. Now, the exception is this: to wage war on God and Muhammad and stir up discord in the Muslim population is punished extremely seriously with crucifixion, cutting off the hands and feet, and so on, or banishment. But I think that crime, and I was speaking to the lawyer, can't be committed now, because Muhammad, of course, is not alive and doesn't have a country in which where the law can be applied. Now, then the second thing that a legislator would have to worry about when saying nothing contrary to the Quran is the position of women. And this doesn't concern crime, it concerns human rights. And as we all know, there are certain things in the Quran about women which are contrary to non-Muslim views about human rights. A woman has half the evidentiary power, two women to one man, when dealing with laws of, is there any one particular matter? I think it's a commercial contract, I think, just for a commercial contract. There are rules around inheritance, which again disfavor women, and instead of women must have modest dress and a scarf down to the neckline, and must not make immodest glances, but nor must men, so that's equal between the two, and must not stamp their feet to attract attention. And those are the only things in the Quran, so far as I can see, where women are singled out, and you might say are given lesser rights than men. I know two other ones. They must not marry an idolater, and a husband can hit a wife if she is high-handed. So you see that there are slight embarrassments about that, and I have often been asked in the last few days by women who've read a note I've written on this, what about divorce? And of course there are some inequalities in divorce as well. Now that is the extent of the limitations on a Muslim parliament which is democratic, which says nothing contrary to the Quran should happen. That's the extent of the inequality in human rights which it imposes. I just want to end very quickly by saying that in Britain and America, we have a democracy which is not an ideal form of democracy. I mentioned that Gordon Brown has never had a majority in the national vote. Most parliaments and most governments never have in Britain. So the third party, which is of course very unfair in many ways. Obama won the last election in America by a landslide. That landslide was 2.5% of the vote. He won by 52.5%, and yet he got a landslide in the country. Now that form of democracy is all right in those two countries. The first past the post is a very simple system. You get landslides. it's all right in those two countries because they've had it for a long time, they're used to it, and the ones who lose feel confident they'll win next time. And so they put up with the inconvenience of losing one election to win the next one. But in new democracies, that has not worked. And in the 60s, all new democracies failed because one party won an enormous majority, and the minority was immediately felt it would never have justice or power, and they didn't, and very often end up with a one-party state. So with a new democracy, it's extremely important that everybody who votes feels they own the constitution, the parliament, and the government. And that means that you have broad coalitions in a new democracy if you want to make everybody feel that they are content and happy living in that democracy. And if you do have a broad coalition, that incidentally is very close to the Islamic ideals of consultation, conciliation, communion, and as Oscar Kelly just said, consensus. That is what really a coalition is. And that is what British and American governments don't have. They're tough and in, out, either in or out. But there's another form of democracy which is taking place mostly on the continent, where you have broad coalitions, and that sort of government, that sort of democracy is acceptable to new countries because everybody feels I am in this. I'm not excluded because I voted for the minority. And I believe it's also a very Muslim attitude to say that we should have a coalition of Muslims and the British and American system. We'll take it later then.
Well, that was uncannily perfect in terms of timing. I don't know how you did it to the second bit. Well done. Kirsten, are you going to stand lecture? Are you going to... Okay, so this is Dr Kirsten Schulze from the London School of Economics. I'm not quite sure what she's going to be talking about. I'm sure
and I don't have a watch on, so you're going to have
you
to
don't, I do.
wave at me when I'm getting to the end or something like that. Right, I've been asked to speak about Indonesia. And Indonesia is an interesting case study because it's the largest Muslim country around, and it's also a fairly recent democracy. So I want to actually give you a little bit of background on how Islamic democracy works in Indonesia, and sort of really sort of go a bit back so that you can see where the sort of debates come in. Indonesia was decolonized or gained independence in 1945. And at the time, there was a really vivid debate going on within the nationalist elite on whether the country, which is 92% Muslim, 240 million people today, should be an Islamic state or not. And those who argued for Islamic state, well, obviously they were arguing on the grounds that we have a Muslim majority. As a Muslim majority, we should be an Islamic state, and we should have Sharia at least as one of the principles of legislation. At the time, the secular nationalists, and I'm going to put secular in quotation marks because the concept of secular does not exist in Indonesia, but the nationalists argued that if we go ahead with this Islamic state, we will lose the minority. And this was a very powerful argument because of the way Indonesia is arranged geographically. Indonesia is spread across 17,000 islands. The central island of Java, which has the largest amount of population, but the smallest amount of resources, is predominantly Muslim. The outer islands, which have a lot of resources, have a lot of Christian, Hindu, and Buddhist minorities on them. And so there was a fear there that if they went down the Islamic route, some of the outer islands would go down the independence route, and with them the resources would disappear. And that would make the whole state project unviable. The nationalists won the debate. And there was an attempt at having democracy, a Muslim identity, but a sort of non-Islamist ideology for the first 10 years. It didn't work out particularly well. There were tensions there between the president, his party, the military, some of these sort of more Islamists who were still trying to get the Islamist agenda in. And there was also an increasingly popular communist party which was making inroads, and eventually the whole thing collapsed in a sort of one-party state. We then have, from 1965 up until 1997, a military dictatorship, which was fiercely nationalist and had this idea that Muslim political expressions were dangerous, that Islam could not coexist with, never mind democracy, but even with any other sort of kind of nationalist system, and the Muslims were very much sort of, Islam was relegated to a sort of non-political, cultural kind of expression. Anyone who wanted to organize around Muslim principles had to sign up to the state ideology, which was non-Islamist. But what happened during the last couple of years of this dictatorship was that as Indonesia grew and people became more educated, you had the establishment of an indigenous middle class. And this became really, really important to the democratization process that then happened. It was not democratization imposed from the outside. This is something that came from within. It came from the next generation, educated children of people who were part of this dictatorship, who thought differently. And it was ultimately the students who brought the Indonesian dictatorship down in the period between 97 and 98. This was also sort of propelled by the Asian financial crisis. The system was broke. People were out on the streets demonstrating. And these students saw no problem between having a democracy, a Muslim identity, and tried to sort of put this idea forward. In 98, Suharto, the authoritarian dictator at the time, was forced to resign, and a period of instability came about. And this question that we had right at the beginning in 1945, should Indonesia be an Islamic state, was raised again in Parliament. And there were a lot of things going on. It was a very confusing period of transition. There were some of these sort of smaller islands that were sort of seeking independence, tried to sort of use that period to sort of push down that route. There were intercommunal tensions in some islands between Christians and Muslims. It was a very unstable period, and in this sort of whole explosive dynamic, we have the re-raising of this initial question. There was a parliamentary debate, and we're now sort of talking about in the context of an emerging democracy. It's not fully fledged at that point. But they sat down again, they reanalyzed the system, and they came up with exactly the same conclusion. No, we don't really want to go down the route of an Islamic state. They even had a vote on it, and the Islamists got roughly about 25%, which is just about what they had initially when we look at the 1945 period. It was also interesting that in this context of the transition, that we have different motivations for Islam being put forward as an alternative ideology. And here we can sort of see a couple coming out. One was within the context of the financial crisis. A lot of people lost their livelihoods, banks went bankrupt, people were heavily unemployed, and the state was unable to address this increasing impoverization of the population. Islamist groups stepped into the gap, and many of them tried to sort of, with helping out through charity and through finances, tried to sort of push an ideology. But the population as a whole, while they were initially very interested, as time went on, did not buy into the ideology bit. They thought it was very good for these organizations to be involved at the grassroots level. They thought the education was great, the free healthcare, but they really didn't want to take it one step further. Some of these groups then decided to set up political parties, and they did run in the first elections that you had post-authoritarianism in 1999, and they've run again twice at the parliamentary level, and we have in September this year our second direct presidential elections. They haven't really done that well. If one looks at it, the only truly Islamist party that was running in the first elections was the Justice Party. They got about 8% of the vote. They had at the time sort of this great plan, within the next 20 years we're going to capture the majority and we're going to turn this into an Islamist state. Well, eventually, as we moved towards the second set of elections, they ran again, and their vote didn't increase the way they had expected it. What is really interesting that is in the context of being part of this emerging democracy, they started responding to the people. So it was no longer the agenda that they were setting, but they were also, because they had these grassroots contacts, trying to take on board some of the comments that they were getting from their support base. And if you look at the Justice Party today, it now calls itself the Justice and Prosperity Party. It no longer has Islamic State on top of the agenda. Through engagement in the democratic process, some of the priorities of the party have changed. It has now become the anti-corruption party. It's the party at the spearhead of the anti-corruption sort of drive within Indonesia, and they're doing very well. Another area where we see sort of Islam that came up right after the fall of Suharto was in the context of communal conflicts. And in that period of transition, some of effectively what we have coming up is a game of politics of identity. And it's not so much about Islam in terms of the religion or even in terms of Islamist state projects, but it's about asserting a local identity in a sort of smaller local context, in a regional context, and also vis-a-vis the state. And we see here, for example, on the island of Ambon, there was a very vicious conflict that broke out in December 1999, which is in the press always described as this Christian-Muslim conflict. It wasn't actually about religion. This was one about local groups scrambling for an increasingly smaller economic share of the pie, and eventually religion crept in because it was an easy way to mobilize the population. So once the conflict had started, you had Muslims saying, well, this is all of a sudden a jihad. You had, on the Christian side, people claiming it was crusade. You had Muslims from outside the area joining because they thought it was a jihad. And you had a lot of sort of appeals within Europe as well as the US by the Christians, which sort of pointed in the direction, well, Christians are suffering from persecution, things like that. But it wasn't about religion. And once the economic situation was actually addressed, and once the outsiders were removed, the two sides have actually come together since. And then religion, again, is no problem. But nothing actually was done on the religious side. But in that context, you saw religion coming up, but it's died down since the end of the conflict. Another area where religion was pushed very heavily was in some of the post-conflict areas. And here we have the sort of biggest example is Aceh. Aceh is on the tip of Sumatra. I think most of you probably are slightly familiar with it. After the tsunami, it was the area that was the most hit. Well, in the context of resolving the conflict there was a conflict that went on, a separatist conflict for some 3 decades. In the context of resolving it, Islamic law was pushed. And it was not necessarily something that the local population wanted, but it was something that was falsely probably seen as a way of resolving the conflict from the center by the capital in Jakarta. And this is the only part of Indonesia where you now have Sharia legislation functioning side by side with a non-religious national legislation, which is the only legislation in the rest of Indonesia. What is interesting about how it's worked is worked both in positive and negative ways with respect to democracy. It's worked in a positive way. You could probably argue from the perspective of political parties and activism and participation, Aceh is actually one of the most democratic parts of Indonesia. It's the only province that's allowed to have local parties, and the local parties are doing really, really well. But the local parties are not Islamist parties, which is also interesting. The only sort of caveat where it sort of has reduced some of the participation, the introduction of Sharia law, is with respect to the participation of women. One of the elements that were put forward, and that I'm pretty sure you also won't find in the Quran, is that one of the criteria that they have for qualify as a candidate is that you have to pass a Quran reading. And they've put Acehese candidates through this twice now. We've had 2 elections since the end of the conflict. And as it turned out, there weren't many women who applied anyway, but those who did apply didn't pass the Quran reading. And that obviously would also go against all non-Muslim minorities because they wouldn't be able to read the Quran in the first place. But again, this is a peculiar interpretation. This is where I would link up with our introduction. It's an interpretation of Islam. It's not necessarily something that you will find written down. So in Aceh, it's worked both ways. But let me go back to the elections as a whole. And pick up some of the points that were made earlier about which systems fit and which systems don't. Indonesia is very much in the case of coalition governments. And it suits Indonesia very well because you have all these different ethnic groups, you have different religious groups, and even within local customs, there was always an emphasis on reaching consensus and a lot of process of consultation, especially within Javanese culture, where effectively the process of consulting everyone was given far more priority than the actual outcome of the consultation. Everyone had to have their say. That's what was sort of ingrained in the culture. And that has now been translated into democratic participation. They also then decided on a system where they wanted to directly elect the president. And they did that for the first time in 2004. And they're going to have a second go this year. So we have a situation where in 2004 you had parliamentary elections, where you had a different party topping the list of all the parties than you did than the party that the president was from. The president ended up being from a minority party, which meant he had to carefully pick his running mate beforehand, and it's not the case like in the US where you have a running mate from the same party. The running mates in Indonesia tend to be from other parties. So in the 2004 elections, President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono was from the Democrat Party, which was a small new party, didn't get a particularly large share of the vote, because it was new, but he had great personal charisma. He could see he had a military background that was now retired, and he was seen as one of the big reformers, one of the ones who actually came out from within the military to say the military needs to go back to the barracks, it shouldn't be in politics, and therefore led the way. He also played a great role in resolving the Aceh conflict, so he had credibility. He chose as a running mate someone from a completely different party, who had credentials in resolving some of the intercommunal conflicts, but who also came from a business background and had big credentials in terms of economics. Then they both, once they were elected, had to move ahead to choose their coalition. And they decided to bring in one of the smaller Islamic parties because one of the top items on their sort of electoral agenda was to eradicate corruption within Indonesia. So they brought in the Justice Party. So you have within the same coalition the Democrat Party and the Islamist Justice Party. And they've worked really, really well together. The coalition was then broadened to include a couple more other parties. And we will see a probably fairly similar mix happening this year, where we've already had the parliamentary elections in April. The president is running again with the same running mate. He probably will be re-elected because the opposition is not particularly credible. But his party probably won't get the majority. So we have, again, a situation where he's going to have to build a coalition. And in this coalition building process, we're going back to sort of the whole sort of cultural ideas about consensus, as well drawing upon Muslim ideas about consensus and consultation. Let's look a little bit at how democracy works at the sort of grassroots level. And here we've seen effectively an explosion of democracy since the fall of Suharto. So much so that people who were quite skeptical about democratization, who'd had a lot of vested interests in the previous authoritarian regime, they used to sort of scathingly say that you just gone demo crazy rather than democratic. But it was true. Everyone from sort of school children through to students to people in the village all of a sudden wanted to participate. And in a way it was a case of for 30 years they weren't probably allowed to say that much, and therefore they were now sort of making up for it. At least that was the feeling that one got. And the place where one can see it most is probably at the civil society level, looking at the huge proliferation of NGOs, as well as the huge proliferation of magazines, newspapers, and just media in general. And as it turns out, today, Indonesia probably has the freest press in all of Southeast Asia, where anyone can just about write anything, even if it's wrong, and criticize their own leaders, anyone. And democracy has really sort of been embraced by the population. And no one has actually sort of seen that it is contradictory to being Muslim, because at the same time we've also seen a rise in Muslim identity. And democracy has made it possible for Muslims to actually express their own Muslim identity in a much broader way than they were able to under the previous system. Under the previous system, there were sort of aspects of dress that were frowned upon. If you worked in the bureaucracy, your wife definitely was not allowed to wear a hijab because you represented the secular system. But now it's okay. And so people have embraced both Muslim identity, and they have explored boundaries of Muslim identity in different aspects. We have seen also since the last couple of years, seen a rise in different sort of aspects. It's no longer just mainstream local Islam. It's also people are dabbling in interpretations brought back from the Middle East. There's a rise in the Shiite movement in Indonesia, which doesn't have an indigenous Shiite population, but people are dabbling and they feel free to do it. And so I think what we can see from the Indonesian example is that democracy is probably now firmly entrenched. We're past the transition period. Both the Muslim population as well as Muslim parties have embraced democracy. They found a system to make it work. It might not look exactly the same as it does in the West, but it doesn't have to. And they've done very well, and I think I'll probably leave it at that point and just deal with the rest of it in terms of questions.
Very much, Kirsten. So for our final speaker is Edwin O'Hanlon from King's College, and I think he's going to talk about Turkey.
Yes.
Yes, good. I've got that right.
Well, thank you. It's an honor for me to be on the same panel with experts and incredibly delivered very enlightening talks. I'm a PhD student at King's College London. I'm in my first year, so I don't have a list of publications yet. And I'm going to talk about Turkey. That's where I'm from and where I spent most of my life. I previously worked in Turkish think tanks and civil society organizations. And my most recent position was coordinating the Religious State and Society program at TESEM, which is a Istanbul-based think tank. And it's difficult to talk about Islam and democracy in Turkey as much as it is anywhere else, because I feel that debates about democracy and Islam aren't very democratic to begin with. And also it's, I would agree with the introduction and also with other lectures given that it's really a matter of interpretation. And I will talk about the current state of Islam and democracy in Turkey based on the prevalent or the dominant interpretations of both. Just to rush through the history, let's say. As you all know, the Republic of Turkey was founded as part of a post-colonial war that was basically waged against the invaders with perhaps the idea of resuscitating the Ottoman Empire. And the end result, however, was a modern nation state. And it was premised on enacting a clean break from the Ottoman heritage and tradition. And I would say that the modern state that was founded immediately afterwards was a democratic one, and it has indeed made some positive contributions to democracy from the very beginnings. For instance, it introduced free elections and suffrage to women. As early as 1930, women in Turkey were able to vote, and in 1934 they were able to run for elections. There was an attempt to develop a modern political party system as well. Although it started out with a single party regime, then there were attempts to introduce new political parties. And there was also a great emphasis placed on producing a middle class that was basically non-existent. There was a strong gender dimension to the initial years of the Turkish Republic. Women were sort of elevated to the status of men. And it was quite a remarkable challenge for the ideologues at the time to undertake. And these were all indicators of perhaps the early commitment to democracy and the understanding of it. Of course, the picture should, well, as in most cases, it's not all rosy. There were also very negative and undemocratic measures. I would say that from the very beginning, there was an omnipresent and hegemonic state, and its institutions were designed in a way to sort of control and monopolize certain aspects of the regime. And one of those aspects was Islam. Well, I guess, and this is, again, borrowing from literature that was developed much later, that's, let's say, bold enough to talk in detail about how the Turkish state monopolized Islam, and a very particular interpretation of it to the Sunni Hanefi Islam. And this wasn't, unlike Indonesia, if I understood correctly, this wasn't an exclusion of Islam from the sphere of politics. It was more the state taking the lead in controlling and determining where Islam went, and how individuals and institutions were expected to use and to utilize Islam. For instance, there's still an institution called the Directorate of Religious Affairs, which basically determines let's say, the acceptable interpretation of Islam. And for instance, they also monitor the appointment and control of prayer leaders, etc. Ernest Gellner calls the attempt in Turkey from the very beginning to monopolize Islam within the public and private spheres as didactic secularism. It's set out to teach, to almost lead the Turkish citizens towards the right way. It's a cultural project as well as a political one. And again, when we're talking about democracy, obviously we need to discuss political parties. And in Turkey, Turkey, well, let's say, is infamous for its suppression of political party formation and free political party activity. There have been repetitive closures of political parties in Turkey. The most recent one is, you may remember, we had a case where the Supreme Court of Appeals filed a suit against the current AK Party, the Justice and Development Party. And the Constitutional Court decision was a very close one. The Constitutional Court agreed not to prohibit the AK Party, but instead released a fine, and it was a word of warning. And this was quite recent. Happened on the 31st of July 2008. The current law of political parties forbids activities of political parties that organize around race, family, and community, religious or sectarian affiliation. So there's a very decided stance against religion, i.e. Islam-based political activity in Turkey. And throughout the history of political party movements in Turkey, most parties that have been prohibited either had a national ethnic, i.e. Kurdish identity, or a religious, i.e. Muslim identity. So this could easily characterize Turkish state policy towards democratic political party formation and activity as controlling or hegemony. But it's also fair, I think, to note that the advice that the head of the Constitutional Court, Hashim Kılıç, gave to the AK Party was to basically change the law. Now that they have parliamentary majority, the Constitutional Court, if Turkey is to progress towards a more, well, let's say, liberal and democratic political party system, then the law ought to be amended. And indeed, the Constitutional Court agreed that the current administration had the means and the ability to do so. Which brings me to 2 points I want to make. Right now, I feel in Turkey, Islam plays or wears two hats. It's the trigger of democratization, further democratization in Turkey, and it's an impediment to democratic society in Turkey. It's a trigger because when you look at the phenomenon at the political level, the phenomenon of Muslim Democrats, that alone, and the fact that the AK Party, which represents Muslim democratic tradition, was able to muster incredible electoral support and is yet again proven to have the support of the masses in Turkey after the most recent local elections, shows that the idea of combining an Islamic message with political means is not a source of, let's say, allergy to most Turks, and that it's a working model. On the other hand, the AK Party is only able to, let's say, raise this support through moving towards the center of the political spectrum, and also through adopting a more state-like stance, particularly on issues of national sensitivity in foreign policy, for instance. So, on the one hand, you have a progressive political model that's able to introduce elements of Islam to its rhetoric and its policies. On the other hand, you have a political party that feels the need to act state-like in order to continue its, let's say, safe and acceptable existence within the Republic of Turkey. Again, Islam as a trigger of democratization. When you look at Islamic civil society today, it's probably the most forward-thinking, the most progressive type of civil society in Turkey. It's definitely the most inventive. You have right now associations of business people, of women that are able to lobby for their interests in a way that reaches the former or perhaps the non-existent channels of interaction with the state. They're able to surpass the state and push or almost propagate their message through these new inventive means. And I would, for instance, use the example of the civilian constitutional movement. It's basically a movement that followed the suggestion of amending the current 1982 constitution by the AK Party on the eve of the 2007 elections. And right now, the civilian constitution movement is supported by two strands of Turkish civil society, both of which are supported by let's say, the flag bearers of Islamic civil society, i.e. myriad, the Independent Businessmen Association, which represents allegedly Muslim businessmen. So myriad is a member of both platforms that carry the torch of rewriting the civilian constitution. But they're able to enter into partnerships with non-Muslim or traditionally Republican organizations like TÜSİAD, like Kader, which is a professional women's organization. So they're not only able to unite around the goal of improving Turkey's constitution, making it more democratic, with actors that they don't have any real faith-based bond to. And this is, I think, a very bold and very progressive attitude. again, the rhetoric of democracy and human rights in Turkey now is married with Islam, and its main proponents, again, are Islam and civil society. For instance, if you look at organizations such as Başkent Kadın Platform, the Capital Women's Platform, they are basically a feminist, Muslim feminist women. Most of them wear the religious headscarf. And they're the most active, the most ferocious and most effective lobbyists within Ankara on issues of gender. And of course, it becomes ever more convincing when you're surrounded by these incredibly outspoken intellectual women talking about the kind of barriers that they were facing, or they had to face all the way up until perhaps the more recent times with the AK Party rule. So you see the undercurrents of this democratic rhetoric within the Islamic society. And these are all very positive developments, but of course, again, some elements of Islam, or interpretation of Islam, does act as an impediment to democratic society in Turkey as well. This, I think, is, I will borrow again from Dr. Schulze's presentation, this applies especially to the issue of minorities, and to particularly the problem of inter-community conflict. When you look at, and again, I think here Marina Ottaway reminds us that representational democracy in itself creates minorities, because obviously you go to cast your vote and one party will be a minority, and just out of the ballot you will find there are minorities, and you may be one of them. In Turkey, non-Muslim minorities or secularist Turks are increasingly becoming marginalized for their, let's say, their inability or lack of access to the center of the political spectrum, and lack of access to representative mechanisms. A recent study released by a group of researchers explored whether this notion of mahalle baskısı, which translates to literally as neighborhood pressure, this small town mentality, like you mentioned, whether it prevails and whether it presents a constraint on certain, particularly non-Muslim communities in Turkey. And the researchers found, not through a census type of study, but through face-to-face interviews, that in especially local towns or cities in peripheral Turkey, people of a non-Muslim background find that they are often obliged to conceal their religious identity, and that they are also obliged to alter their lifestyles to be able to coexist with their fellow citizens of Muslim background. And this shows that the positive influence that Islam has had on democratization in Turkey also carries the risk of, and if, of course, democratic institutions and mechanisms and rule of law is not enhanced or developed so as to buffer the non-Muslim or, well, yes, non-Muslim Turks, that it runs the risk of becoming another hegemonic, overriding sort of source of power in Turkey. And I want to finish off with a quote from Prof. Walter Emerson. Mr. Kelesh knows how fond I am of stories and quotes. He says that power ceases in the instant of repose. It resides in the moment of transition from a past to a new state. And I just hope that for Turkey, transition, and Turkey is definitely undergoing a transition, the outcome of this transition will be favorable and democratic for all segments of the society. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you for the questions. Thank you very much, Deep Panelists. thank you for the Dialogue Society for hosting this very good event, and I do enjoy it.